Let me begin by thanking Roman who's chairing this session on language and linguistics in Bergsonian thought. We knew that he will do that. Here he is. And by thanking Adma for the preceding paper on language as gateway to the ineffable. My thanks extend to the organizers, the hosting institutions, and to all the colleagues whose work sustain the broader global Bergsonism project. What I will try to do today is straightforward and aim. I want to reconstruct with textual care, this is why you have those handouts, Bergson's philosophy of language around 1900, and to show how it evolved from the earlier dualism of the Essai sur les données immédiates de la conscience into a more articulated account of thought, words, and images. I will focus on the 1898 cours that Bergson gave at the École Normale Supérieure, entitled Les idées générales dans leur rapport avec les mots, les images et les choses, because it has been relatively neglected. Yet it is here that Bergson experiments with a methodologically new and surprising method or approach. It is not intuition, but an indirect comparative path via linguistics and the psychology of language that opens the way for a metaphysics of thought and the question of the articulability of life. This lecture remains unpublished, even though it was first mentioned in the Leçons de psychologie et de métaphysique, which already highlighted its significance when it was published in 1990. So the subsequent quotations from this Les Générales are my own translations, but you also find the French originals on the handout. This is also why the handout has 8 pages, not 4. So I shall then pose, so I come to the title of my talk, a question that matters for global and intercultural work. How should we treat certain problematic statements in the lecture, above all passages that seem to subordinate inferior languages to Indo-European ones? Do these oblige us to discard Bergson's otherwise very attractive vision of language and thought? I will argue that they do not. They require correction only in the form of conceptual update, removing obsolete hierarchies and making explicit the epistemic pluralism and functionalism already implicit in Bergson's analysis, while its deep insights, especially the sentence-based turn and the social function of speech, remain entirely valid. So the desideratum is twofold. First, to give a precise map of Bergson's shifting stance of language between the essay, Matière et Mémoire, Le Rire, and Les Idées Générales. And second, to show how the 1898 material allows, indeed urges, an interpretation that dispenses with Eurocentric hierarchies while retaining Bergson's central thesis about the priority and mobility of thought, the sentence as the decisive unit, and the social function that shapes the grammatical split of subject and predicate. So I will start with situating Bergson's problem of language between the essay and Le Rire. Bergson's early hypothesis in the essay is well known. Language is in principle late with respect to the individual moment. It tends to spatialize and to transform living continuity into stable objects suited for communication and social coordination. To hear the texture of that argument, let me read a representative passage from the first book, published 9 years earlier before the Idées Générales. I quote, "If each of us lived a purely individual life, if there were neither society nor language, would our consciousness grasp the series of inner states in this unbroken form? Our tendency to form a clear picture of this externality of things and the homogeneity of their medium is the same as the impulse which leads us to live in common and to speak. Thus, a second self is formed, which obscures the first, a self whose existence is made up of distinct moments, whose states are separate from one another and easily expressed in words." End quote. So this is the point of departure. Language belongs to the construction of a shared homogeneous milieu. It is not uniquely a deficiency. This is an important point I want to stress. This is also why I tend to quote passages where Bergson says things like, yeah, language easily expresses things. So it is necessary for social life. This is the basic thing. So, but of course, it does not capture the infinitely mobile qualities of lived duration because it reifies them. In his 1973 book, Le langage et l'individuel, Jean-Claude Parient famously underlined the dualistic consequence that follows if one stops here at the essay. I quote Parient, having divided being into two great regions, that of space and that of duration, Bergson resolutely excludes the individual in order to confine it to the latter. All individuality pertains to duration. Everything that endures is individual. The individual, this end quote, the individual hence cannot be expressed. This is the logical consequence. As Parient furthermore noticed, this dualism softens in Matière et Mémoire and is recast further in Le Rire. In Matière et Mémoire, Bergson integrates linguistic facts with a theory of images and memory. Language functions not in the brain, discussed this already earlier, as a mere mechanism, but as a disciplined memory, a system of learned distinctions, rules, and uses. Bergson stresses this by citing aphasia cases and by summarizing his claim that language is, I quote, only memory. This shift is methodological. Bergson begins to look not only at the concept, but at the sentence. I will not say proposition, we'll understand later on why. So, sentence as the articulated movement of utterance. I quote from Bergson memory, verbs in general, which essentially express imitable actions, are precisely the words that a bodily effort might enable us to recapture when the function of language has all but escaped us. Proper names, on the other hand, being of all words the most remote from the impersonal actions which our body can sketch out, are those which a weakening of the function will earliest effect in aphasia cases. It is a noteworthy fact that the aphasic patient, who has become as a rule incapable of finding the noun he seeks, may replace it by an appropriate periphrasis, into which other nouns, and perhaps even the evasive noun itself, enter. But the idea is that he gets it by the sentence. Unable to think of the precise word, he has thought of the corresponding action, and this attitude has determined the general direction of a movement from which the phrase then springs. End quote. So by 1900, in Le Rire, the language-life relation undergoes a further notable shift. Bergson still holds that language risks rigidity, yet he now stresses the adjustment of language to life, even calling language itself, I quote, something living, when it faithfully follows mind's forms. I quote, language only attains laughable results because it is a human product modeled as exactly as possible on the forms of the human mind. We feel it contains some living element of our own life. And if this life of language were incapable of being split up into independent organisms, it would evade the comic, as would a soul whose life was one harmonious whole, unruffled as the calm surface on a peaceful lake. End quote. Parient's well-known judgment is that the original thesis of the essay, that, I quote, we necessarily express ourselves by means of words, and we usually think in terms of space, in this famous opening paragraph in the preface, undergoes in laughter, I quote, a significant shift. So in the literature, this already has been shown. Language can be, due to Parient, more or less spatial, depending on its adaptation to reality. So against Parient, I will only argue that this evolution does not begin only with meta memory. It is no doubt already in preparation in 1896, but finds its first fulfillment in the 1898 course, Les idées générales dans le rapport avec les mots, les images et les choses, which I translate to universals in their relations towards images and things. We can discuss this translation, but I've recently translated as universals. So I will proceed to the next section of my talk and give you an account what Bergson is presenting in his linguistic analysis. The 1898 course opens with a problem of universals. That would be a first reason. Bergson refuses to start from either pure individuality or abstract generality. He argues for an intermediate stratum, neither fully perceptual nor already conceptual, from which both individual and universal can be derived. I quote, "What is given to a child's mind first is neither the distinct perception of individuals nor the distinct conception of the genus. It is something intermediate, a vague feeling of resemblance." I will get back on this. Remember this, a vague feeling of resemblance. This feeling will, on the one hand, become sharpened into concepts, into general ideas, and on the other hand, become thickened, divided into representations of individual objects. This intermediate intellectual state between perception and concept is the common ground on which both the universal and the individual will take root. End quote. The immediate question then is methodological. Can we reach this common ground that Bergson will qualify later on as thought before language, another subject that we're already discussing in our last talk? Thought before language by a turn toward immediacy of intuition, however we qualify this further. And surprisingly, Bergson argues that intuition is not suitable here because what we find may simply be stratified words. He therefore proposes an indirect method, comparative and experimental. I quote, "We shall begin with a study of the relations between the world and the idea, and by drawing on experimental psychology, even on the most general results of philology, we shall attempt to grasp thought, if not before language, at least at the very point where the reflection of the idea into words takes place." It's kind of cautious here if you can really get to pure thought, but this is the aim. In addition, Bergson, methodologically speaking, elaborates. Quote again, "The result of the foregoing is that it is not absurd to inquire what thought is or could be without speech. If one merely acknowledges that it may be impossible for thought to abstract itself directly and immediately from the mode of language, then by considering languages that share neither kinship nor affinity of any kind, and by extracting from these languages what they have in common, one could still at this time indirectly free oneself from what speech adds or subtracts from thought." End quote. Two consequences follow. First, Bergson denies the identification of thought and word, defended by Friedrich Max Müller and many other linguists in the late 19th century. And he also refuses the nominalism proposed by Hippolyte Taine, these two important authors from the 19th century that he's discussing in this text, before we discuss Plato and Aristotle and Kant, of course. Though he takes the challenge seriously and rehearses their position carefully. Second, he relocates the center of analysis from the concept to the sentence, to the cadence and logic of the phrase, as in meta-memory. In a concise formulation, I quote again, "What strikes one first in the verbal expression of thought is the general form of the sentence. It is affirmative, or negative, or interrogative. Let us consider these different attitudes of thought in their relation to one another." Of the object of analysis. Bergson then distinguishes two fundamental sentence types, and here he ties grammar to time and space in an entirely new way. I will show you this. You'll find the quote on your handout. One can first express a thought by means of a subject, a verb, and an object. The child beats the dog. We take the scene and view it in a dramatic way. We distinguish within it a principal actor, the child, an action that proceeds from this agent, and a patient that receives the action, the dog. Second type, we take a subject and regard it as contained within another term, which we call the predicate, included in it from the point of view of extension, and including it from the point of view of comprehension, subject, copula, predicate. The first mode of expression is dynamic, cinematographic in nature, the second is static. In the first case, the mode of representation involves temporal considerations. In the second case, there is spatial representation, end quote. This is a genuine innovation in his philosophical trajectory. It links the form of expression to a temporal or spatial mode and prefigures what later linguists will call aspect of predication type. With this methodic approach, Bergson anticipates an idealist objection that goes like this. Even if you silence the words, the form of language, its grammar, may still organize consciousness. He concedes the force of this argument and uses it to motivate comparison across diverse language families. That is, if grammatical frames differ across languages, we can reason toward what is in common in thought. Give another quote. For one will say, so that is the imagined idealist, you set aside the words, all the material substances of language, but the form remains, the grammatical frameworks into which you insert your thought. One may have forgotten a verse and still recall its rhythm, and yet the rhythm, the logic of speech remains. Thus, in believing that you have reached pure thought, it is still language that you're dealing with. Against this, then, he says, by considering languages that have evolved in different directions and comparing them with one another, one might, perhaps, he is still cautious, through the elimination of their proper and specific differences, recover the genus. That is to say, in the end, thought itself. End quote. Working inductively from linguistic phenomena, Bergson argues that language did not begin with isolated words, but with sentences, holophrastic units that expressed complex representations, as he says, all at once. He proposes a psychogenetic origin of inflection as instinctive marks of relations prior to any logical conceptualization. I give another quote. Language could not have begun with a word, but with a sentence. The conclusion to be drawn from this is that language first expressed complexes of ideas and did so all at once, each time as if by an explosion. But at the same time, at this force, one of the creative forces of language, which express things as by explosion, manifests itself another force that is at work in the opposite direction, by virtue of which words tend to join together to become solidary with one another. End quote. From here, the analysis proceeds to residual categories. After successive eliminations, what remains are the noun and the pronoun. So Bergson does this in detail. I cannot present this, very technical and long. And then the balanced pair, noun and adjective. The argument about the verb then is stated as follows. I will quote, what ultimately remains are the noun and the pronoun and the verb. Of these three terms, noun, pronoun, and verb, there's one that is not irreducible, the verb. First, certain languages do not possess it. Next, in our own language, if we trace the verb back to its origins, we find that it is derived. I'll give examples of this. So shall we say that there is in the word something absolutely irreducible, primitive, namely the distinction of tenses, like past, present, future tense? But this, he says, is so really essential to the word that we see certain languages as perfect as our own, the Semitic languages. So he recognizes the Semitic languages as equal to the Indo-European. We'll discuss this later. Not having arrived at a clear distinction among the different tenses. It is a refinement, not the essence. So now turning to noun adjective. Grammatical comparison seems to lead into a circle. Logic would require the noun to precede. Linguistics suggests that nouns often solidify from adjective. He gives examples like le soleil originally means le brillant, le père means le protecteur, and so on. So his way out of this goes by a biological metaphor, which does not come really. The noun and the adjective have emerged through a process of sissiparity by the division of one and the same original term, containing with itself those characteristics which, later diverging, eventually become consolidated into two distinct but complementary verbal categories. End quote. Finally, and this will matter for our later discussion of social function, Bergson makes the genealogy of subject and predicate dependent on communicative need. Speech forces or at least stabilizes the primordial division of representation because it is a social function. Not a new idea, but he elaborates, I quote, "What is the destination of language? It is a function of social nature. Thus, once the representation in my mind is posited, in order for this representation to tend towards expression, it must itself divide into two parts. It must set aside on one side everything in it that indicates the relationship to all other men, that would symbolize society's point of view upon it, and on the other side, everything that expresses my own point of view upon it, that is to say, what I contribute, what is new in it. In view of these two directions, the direction toward the social point of view is that of the subject, the other is that of the predicate. The essence of this function is to make every representation two parts. The stable, the unstable, the static and the changing, the absolute and the relative. So in short, the 1898 course develops a coherent picture. First, there exists a pre-conceptual, pre-individual, vague feeling of resemblance, which leads to thinking. 2, an indirect comparative method is necessary because intuition cannot by itself peel away grammar. 3, the sentence is primary with distinct temporal dynamic and static spatial types. 4, early language is holophrastic. 5, many grammatical essences, or what we think are essences, are refinements rather than essences or origins. And 6, subject and predicate can be understood functionally from social communication and not as purely logical a priori. That's one of the basic thoughts of the Secours. So now I get to the sensitive material. Bergson raises the possibility that where sentences have a different subtraction or foundation, different immediately applicable logic will follow. He then adds a series of comparative remarks that take on a hierarchical tone. I give you 2 quotes. First, our logic is that of subsumption. Must we carry this idea to its limit? Must we say that if Aristotle, instead of being Greek, had been Mexican, he would have had an entirely different logical system? That would be a gross exaggeration. One may claim that if the inferior languages had fully developed, they might perhaps have approached from similar to our own. And above all, one may claim that if these inferior languages stopped in their development, it is perhaps precisely because their logic was inferior to ours, not modeled as is ours, on the true relations of things. Very surprising for Bergson. End quote. And again, in a passage explicitly refusing to place on a par idioms whose evolution, as he says, stopped early with the Indo-European languages, whose development, as he says, was continuous and uninterrupted. I quote, "The idea would never occur to us to place on the same level the modes of expression proper to peoples whose evolution must have stopped very early, and on the other hand, the highly subtle modes of our Indo-European languages, whose evolution has been continuous and uninterrupted. There can be no question of putting them on the same plane. Nevertheless, if languages of that kind had undergone a long development, they would not have evolved in the same direction as ours. And the more perfect forms they would have reached, they would have been very different from our grammatical forms." End quote. Just the contrary of what he said before. Okay, we'll come back to this. So these sentences are, from a global and intercultural perspective, of course, problematic. They confuse difference of grammatical profile with deficiency in logic. They project the unilinear model of development, and they use inferior, superior, as if linguistic type tracked philosophical veracity. If one were to take the value judgments as essential to the theory, one would have to reject Bergson's philosophy of language. But I do not think that this is either necessary or even faithful to the best of Bergson's analysis. So we will give an interpretation with the principle of charity. So I give four reasons why we do not have to discard Bergson. First, the comparative method itself refuses unilinearity. When Bergson defends an indirect method by extracting what is common across unrelated languages, he treats diversity as epistemologically productive. He does not say, choose the most advanced grammar and infer thought from it. He says, compare unrelated families to strip away what words add to thought. And this is a pluralist gesture at the level of method. Second reason, he explicitly separates grammatical refinement from origin and essence. On verbs and tense, he says it's a refinement, not the essence. So if tense distinctions are a refinement, then lacking them is not a lack of logic. It is a different allocation of grammatical work across the system. And this supports a functional reading rather than a hierarchical one. Third reason why to not discuss Bergson's theory of language. He interprets subject-predicate as socially functional, not as metaphysically necessary. When subject and predicate arise to meet communicative needs, the stable and mobile parts needed for public exchange, then a language that distributes this work differently is not thereby inferior. It has a different functional profile that still serves the social task of making representation shareable. Fourth reason, he allows, sometimes explicitly, for genuinely different grammatical logics. Bergson notes that some inferior items, as he expresses himself, there's no subsumption, but juxtaposition. As in examples he gives from the Borneo languages, where ton père est vieux is expressed as père de toi, vieille de lui. One can drop the label inférieur and retain the insight. There are languages whose syntax does not center on copular predication and yet remain perfectly serviceable vehicles for general thought. The valuable claim is the non-identity of grammar and logic. The logic of propositions is a special logic shaped by the frames into which language inserts thought. So on this basis, we can give a reinterpretation that is epistemically pluralist. Different languages, by virtue of different subtractions, can project different profiles on explicit logical forms, while still answering to a shared pre-linguistic capacity for generalization. The vague feeling of resemblance that Bergson posited the origin, the comparative method extracts just invariance at exactly this level. Then we should read it functionally, not essentially. Grammatical categories are tools shaped for communication. The essence is the function they perform in distributing the stable, mobile, social individual sides of representation. A language may implement this distribution through copular predication or through serial verbs, particles, morphology, very differently. None of these implementations is a priori superior or necessary. This follows directly from Bergson's social genealogy of subject and predicate. So within this functionalist pluralist frame, the course's most daring philosophical move, bringing logic back under language and language back under life, gains force and not weakness. The claim is not that concepts like substance and cause are arbitrary, rather that the grammatical history of our languages has specialized these categories, narrowing what was originally more general in thought. Here's another formulation that expresses this. I quote last time, "It is indeed from the form of the proposition that Kant set out in order to arrive at the pure concept. But if the form of our propositions were due above all to certain habits that language has caused thought to contract, then the pure concept of the understanding might, to some extent, contain something contingent and accidental." Pure horror for Kant. Yet it is also true that, however essential these ideas of substance and cause may be, for science, for instance, they must have undergone a narrowing simply by virtue of having become the foundations of language. End quote. Read in a pluralist key, this is not cultural triumphalism. It is a program for de-absolutizing the particular grammatical metaphysics we inherited and for seeking what is universal beneath the special logics that sentences make salient in different traditions. My time is over?
You can continue.
Okay. Okay. It's not much more. I just want to complete the picture because Bergson says more that goes beyond pure grammar. So he does not end with grammar. He returns in the 1898 course to the dynamic source of thinking that speech does not create, but channels. So there's also the idea that we discussed before, that thinking is prior, but enters the mode of language. And once it is in that mode, thinking is reshaped by speech. I come back to two citations to give a condensed viewpoint of this. First, again, the analogy of holophrastic explosion and the solidarity of words. I cut it a bit. Language first expressed complexes of ideas as if by an explosion. I already read this. But at the same time, words tend to join together. So we have this double movement to become solidary with one another. So the second point illuminates the images of thought as the luminous source that languages reflect and colors. This is very beautiful. I give you a quote that I did not yet read. I don't know if you have it on the paper. I did not put everything on it. Thought is the original cause. Words reflect it, sending back with a determined hue the colorless, purely luminous rays that thought had emitted towards them. End quote. It's also from Les Générales. I think this is a magnificent metaphor. Language does not invent thought, but it dresses it, it colors it, and makes it appear in the sensible world, while at the same time modifying its original nature. Both images are compatible with functional pluralism. Different languages color the same rays differently. No single clarity is privileged a priori. What matters is that the rays be there at all. The pre-linguistic power to link, to generalize, to hold together the vague feeling of resemblance that will shape them into concepts or thicken into individuals. So to close, let me reformulate Bergson's core ideas as follows. 4 points. There's a level of thinking, preconceptual and pre-individual, that grounds both generality and individuation. Second, because intuition remains linguistically framed, we must approach this level indirectly by comparing diverse languages and expecting invariance. Third point, grammar is a set of social tools. It makes thought speakable, so to say, by distributing stability and mobility. Different languages may realize this distribution differently without any loss of rational capacity. 4 philosophical categories inherit a specialized logic from grammatical habits. Philosophy should therefore practice a vigilant genealogy of its own vocabulary, neither absolutizing any local grammar nor denying what is common in thinking. With this, I can end where I began. The 1898 course should neither be ignored, not at all, nor accepted wholesale. It should be read critically and constructively. If we remove its hierarchical evaluations, which actually run counter to its own method, we recover an early, remarkably modern proposal, a sentence-based linguistics of expression, a social functionalism of grammar, and an epistemic pluralism capable of engaging languages beyond the Indo-European horizon, while still asking what, in thought, remains shared. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Tobias, for this masterful articulate presentation, further facilitated with the handouts. So we have 15 minutes for discussion. And actually, I have 2 questions that came to my mind, but I don't want to steal from your time, so I will ask them if there's time or maybe later separately. Please, the floor is yours.
Just one remark. I apologize if I attended the first part, but the latter part, and I really love the quotation that you brought, that language addresses and colors.
Yes, beautiful.
It really summarizes the relationship between language and thought in the point of view of Bergson. It said that yes, language is a medium of communication. There is the primacy of thought over language, but it is not a neutral medium. It can distort, it can shape, it can change. So either for the better or for the worse. So yes, and thank you so much. That was really instructive.
Juste une remarque interesting. La remarque concerne Jean-Claude Fasson. Il a évoqué dans son livre que Bergson a été un mauvais architecte.
Oui.
Est-ce que vous pouvez faire un contre-interprétation de ce que invoque Wittgenstein lorsqu'il dit que Bergson a été un mauvais architecte? Selon vous, est-ce que Bergson, en matière de langage, a été un bon architecte lorsqu'il diffère le non-son, l'insensé et le vide-son? Et la question concerne la thèse latine de Bergson. Vous avez commencé par le livre de la thèse principale, 1889. Je crois que Bergson a commencé ce langage dès 1885, dans son thèse latine, lorsqu'il a dit dans sa préface que la pensée cachée d'Aristote mérite d'être interprétée suivant le contexte en 1870. Il y a un rappel ou un retour au langage aristotélicien. Donc, c'est peut-être une approche bergsonienne de la thèse latine.
Merci beaucoup pour ces remarques et ces questions. Oui, je pense que j'ai essayé de montrer qu'effectivement, Bergson n'est pas le mauvais architecte dont Parion pense l'est. Voilà, il y a, je pense, des raisons pourquoi. Voilà, dans ce livre, Bergson il constitue le tout premier chapitre dans le langage individuel. Après, il passe à autre chose et qu'il n'est pas très satisfait. En même temps, je pense ce qu'il a démontré du bien, c'est qu'effectivement, il y a une évolution, il y a un développement déjà dans le tout premier Bergson, entre l'essai et le rire, où cette thèse, celui qui critique, qu'il a confié l'individu dans la durée. Je pense que c'est une critique profonde qui aboutit bien. Et je pense le mérite de Pariente pour les recherches bergsoniennes est justement qu'il a réussi de montrer que c'est pas si facile, qu'il y a quelque chose qui se passe. Pour le reste, j'ai essayé aussi de montrer que je ne suis pas de l'avis entièrement de Pariente et que j'essaie de montrer que c'est encore plus compliqué qu'il pensait. Du coup, je pense que j'ai essayé de montrer que effectivement Bergson est un bon architecte. Et je vais continuer de raisonner pour cela en vous répondant à votre deuxième question. Effectivement, je ne savais pas qu'il s'exprime déjà dans sa thèse latin sur le problème du langage. Tout simplement pas lu dans ce prisme-là. Et c'est bien à savoir, mais voilà, ça juste confirme une observation qui m'a frappé dès que j'ai commencé de lire Bergson, il y a quelques années, justement, et c'est que le problème du langage s'exprime dans tous ces livres. C'est toujours là. C'est justement, je trouve, pas toujours suffisamment élaboré. Et justement, dans ce texte que j'ai présenté aujourd'hui, là, je trouve que c'est parfaitement élaboré. Et du coup, ça explique bien pourquoi il y a ce développement et pourquoi Bergson revient toujours sur le problème du langage, qui a effectivement, le dites, commencé de sa thèse, voilà, de l'essai et sa thèse sur Aristote. Voilà. Il a écrit en même temps. Il y a aussi, vous avez parlé d'un retour chaque œuvre, et je pense que c'est aussi remarquable qu'effectivement, à toute fin de sa vie, il est revenu aussi avec la pensée et le mouvement à la question de ce que c'est la pensée et la relation entre la pensée et la manière dont on s'exprime. Et du coup, oui, c'est quelque chose de profond au niveau de Bergson qui est compliqué et j'imagine un problème qui ne va pas lâcher.
Clara,
Yes, my first question is was really interesting your presentation. And my first question regards one of the quotations of Bergson course, where you mentioned this vague feeling of assignment to the individual perception and conception. I was intrigued by because I don't know you said you were going to come back to it. Maybe I missed it. But this, why does he describe this as a feeling? And if it has any connection, which one with what you said also regarding another quotation discourse, where in page number 5, where you were hitting the concept of form, rhythm, and pure thought. Is there a connection between this and this feeling in between individual perception and perceptions? And my last question is about the indirect use that we can do of language in order to subtract what language adds a fact to thought, if I understand correctly. What role has art plays in this indirect use?
Okay, thank you very much, Clara, for your questions. So why feeling? I actually came back to it thrice. So I think it's just the origin of his reflection. This is something maybe we can contest that in the way, this is the point from where he departs before we have separation into general concepts and individual perception. Why feeling? I guess just because Bergson is or wants to be a non-cognitivist, we spoke in your talk, actually, there was this early reception in Argentina that perceived him actually as a rationalist. It's very interesting because, I mean, this you have to contextualize, of course. Of course, he's not an irrationalist. I guess Bergson scholars would easily agree on this, but I think we could also easily agree on the fact that Bergson is a non-cognitivist. So he's not a rationalist in the classical sense. So I find this compelling, but I mean, this is open for discussion. I think it is the only route if we actually want to relativize the a priori the way he does it. So, and to try to show that there is actually thinking prior to language, because it's complicated to think that, to show that, just because of the argument that he employed himself from the fictional idealist who says like, okay, you can, what you're doing is just pretending to get out of language. Actually, once you're into language, you cannot get out. So this is a challenge, and I think this is very conscious of that. As to your second question of rhythm, yes, I think there is a connection between this way he argues at this point and the point of departure in feeling, because rhythm, I think, is something you can easily relive by getting a feeling just of rhythm. So, and he uses it as something like as a way he could object to the idealist. He could get out of this argument and say, yeah, you know, I can strip off the words, and I can only get back to the rhythm, and then maybe I can find where thinking or how thinking moves when trying to grasp the world. And so, yeah, I think there's an eternal link between feeling and this kind of wanting to strip off language and get to pure thinking. Yeah. As to your third question, this is the most complicated because the indirect method that I presented concerns only linguistics. For now, so the question would be, can we extend this to the arts, for instance? I don't know, I have to think about it. My first inner reaction was like, we should maybe double check and do the linguistic work for other languages, because Bergson only does it with the languages that he masters. So his actual linguistic and philological, genealogical work is basically with Latin and ancient Greek. So it would be interesting to test this, I don't know, with Arabic, Chinese, and to see if we arrive at the same invariance. To enlarge this project. How to enlarge it beyond language, this indirect approach. I cannot, I have to think about it. I give it.
Yeah. Leave the complicated ones to the
Yes, exactly. Maybe we talk through it over lunch.
Peace was gonna ask, and peace first and then talk. Okay.
Thank you so much. So I had a question about what you said about Bergson's philosophy of logic, the mission of Bergson. And you said that the most can you understand?
A bit louder, please.
So I have a question about what you said about Bergson's philosophy of logic.
Yeah.
And its supposed pluralism. So you said at some point that his most direct philosophical move is bringing logic back out of language and language back. And I wonder if this moves, to what extent this move allows him to recognize different logical systems. Because it seems to me that if you go from life to logic, you can indeed recognize all these different logics that are embodied in language that are coming from needs in life. But in the 20th century, it appears to me that most alternative logics, like intuitionist logic or tree-valued logic, do not stem from language or life. Right? They come from developments in science, they come from new insights in how we can form our logical system. So I wonder if his pluralism in logic is actually constrained by thinking Islam.
Yeah. I have to admit that I don't know enough about it. The only thing I know about it that, for instance, Indian philosophy has a very complex system of logic that is not exactly ours. So I don't know if you could reduce it to ours. I don't know. There's work to be done, I guess, intercultural work on that. But we have knowledge that different types of logic, different developed systems of logic coexist that are not necessarily in contradiction. So as for the question of paraconsistent logic, I agree with you. This does not really tackle the problem. This does not really touch exactly the same ground. So the interesting thing would really be to see how do different logical systems that do not stem from our own tradition relate to our own.
But I think that so for Indian logic, you can still say it's derived from the language, in which it was formed. But if you take intuitionistic logic, for example, or other like three-value logic, this is not coming from language. It's coming from, oh, I'm going to give a new basis to mathematics, and I reject the principle of excludability. Right? And it seems to me that in the 20th century, most alternative logics come about this way, right? Which is very different from an analysis of language and therefore the amount of.
Okay, but I don't see exactly the problem. Of course, I mean, this is not in contradiction with what Bergson says. Of course, paraconsistent nor any form of three-value logic fall under the idea of the logic of subsumption, the way he presents it. Right? You're not happy with that?
No, but let's stop it.
Okay, over there now.
We continued for the discussion and I think Marcel.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate your effort to remove the part with the characterization and the hierarchization and to try to understand the coherence, the historical coherence. But I'd like to have more historical context about the sources of these reflections on language. So he quoted something mentioning experimental psychology and the most general results of philology. So I was wondering what kind of sources he was using, and maybe also for this conception of language as something living. So I have in mind early semantic theory, like Darmstadt, Henri, Real, et Maurice. He refers
Bergson actually really dived into linguistics, and the funny thing is he uses a whole list of his sources in this text, and so I just mentioned this briefly. He discusses extensively Friedrich Max Müller, in line with Hippolyte, but of course it's not very interesting. Then of course there's Real that he cites, but this we know already from other courses that have already been published. That it's an important historical source for Bergson. What is new, what I found new is there's also Franz Mistelli, a Swiss philologist, colleague of Nietzsche in Basel. There's Skaes, I think, and there's another three of them. I will send them to you. I cannot recall them all from my head, but yeah, it's basically Real, Franz Mistelli, Friedrich Max Müller. Yeah, and I give you the complete list, but they are there. And
I have also a question about this idea of language as something living and how it is to reconcile with the conception of language as an artifact.
Language as an artifact?
Yeah.
Can you say it again? How to reconcile language as an artifact with?
And with something living. It's another thing. It's just from the talk yesterday.
Well, I think the general thought is just like the stabilizing function of language and the reifying side is somehow necessary to just transport information. And the living side is the more flexible part where language can actually adapt, can be created, can try to follow thinking, which maybe we can relate back to the question of art to explain the conditions of possibility, why at all it is possible that we can use language creatively, like in poems or narration.
Which is an attempt to go beyond the viewpoint of the linguistics.
Yeah, go beyond the static and rich part of language, yes. So, and I think it's very important to see that Bergson's vision of language is not only that it reifies what's living and it makes everything static. So this is the simplistic picture. Thank you.
So to conclude, I would like to ask a question, if I may, that may bring in some sociological insight to this question of a level of thinking which is pre-conceptual and pre-individual, which Bergson formulates as feeling. So, could it be the case that Bergson refers here to a level, like social or intersubjective level of reality, which is like pre-conceptual and pre-individual, at the same time that a newborn baby is subjected to prior to individualization and conceptualization? And if it is the case, we may link it to the concept of Pierre Bourdieu, which is symbolic violence. So Bourdieu says that there is a symbolic type of violence separate from physical violence, which in most cases even maybe more effective type of violence. So maybe like if we say that we first are subjected to like symbolic violence in our social relationship, in our social experience, it may also explain why Bergson puts it as a feeling, because here, like from when we are subjected to a violence, what we experience is a feeling more than a thinking or a rationalization. So because like social uses of language always produces categorizations and classifications and divisions, and those are on a social level imposes themselves on us. So it's also a kind of violence which links to what Asma says about language as a violence. So I don't know if Bergson, like there's a sociological dimension to Bergson thought, but I would like to hear yours.
I think we would have to construct it, taking Bergson further, thinking beyond Bergson with Bergson. My first reaction, if I understood you correctly, you say that feeling actually must be intersubjective. So this could not be a solipsistic party, right?
Yeah.
So I agree on this. He does not elaborate on this, but in a way, I think we must rethink it in a way, although the social factor comes into play later, the way he elaborates it. You know? It's the reflective, pre-conceptual dimension. I don't know. It's hard to say if this is something purely individual or this already needs to be. It must be intersubjectively at least comprehensible, expressible. So I agree with you. It's not for nothing that he brings into play, for instance, scenes where a newborn baby recognizes the face patterns or the gestures of the parents. So the question then still is to come to Bourdieu. What he's trying to unfold here is a pre-symbolic dimension. So do you want to point to pre-symbolic dimensions, also going beyond Bourdieu, of this kind of violence in intersubjective, maybe purely expressive chain. Because this would be the challenge to construct or further construct the problem.
Yeah.
But,
Well, symbolic violence in Bordeaux, I think, may also include like it's not just like through language, actually. It's also maybe through gestures and through, yeah, like acts and every types of expression. So, yeah.
But yeah, maybe you can just understand this way of felt expressiveness as symbolic. This is something I would be open to do as an Epicurean. Bergson, I would be reluctant because it's a major part of his project to take the pre-symbolic. So,
Okay.
Une remarque générale. Le Libanais Kamel Youssefa, en 1949, il a publié sa thèse principale sur la valeur du langage chez Bergson. C'est un ouvrage de référence. Le langage chez Bergson, il est le traducteur du premier de Bergson qui fait ce que les données immédiates également.
Okay, thank you all for this, I think, very active session. So we will have, I think, now 20 minutes break, and then we'll have our sixth session and last session before the discussion, for the conclusion on Bergsonian influence on global literature. Okay, so